A few weeks ago, I made this video. It's about a Dutch study that compared antidepressant treatment with running therapy for adults with anxiety and depression. I'll put a link to it in the description. During the study, the researchers noticed that the patients with the worst symptoms tended to be younger. After I posted the video, I started looking into how age is associated with anxiety and depression. The data is very convincing. Younger adults are much more susceptible, and for the last 12 years or so in the United States, the rate among folks under 65 has been rising. At the same time, the rate among folks over 65 has been steady and perhaps even fallen somewhat. While I was looking into this, something else caught my attention. The incidence of colorectal cancer has been following a similar pattern. The rate has been falling in older adults, while rising in younger adults, with the bulk of the increase happening after 2010. I think the two are linked. Stay around and I'll explain why. Here's the usual caveat. I'm not a healthcare provider, I don't give medical advice, and if you need medical advice, you should reach out to a licensed provider you trust. With that, let's get into it. I'm Cameron and this is my channel. Welcome to the Sexy Universe. If you look at this chart from the American Cancer Society, you can see the overall rate of colorectal cancer in the U.S. has fallen since 1998. These other charts break it out by age. From the scale on the left, you can see that the vast majority of cases show up in folks over 65, and the rate among that group has fallen by more than half. But for folks between 50 and 64, it bottomed in the early 2010s. It's been rising since then. Here's another chart in the same study that shows the breakout for folks who are in their 50s. The time period from 1975 to 1979 is in red, and the rate was lower for people in their early 50s and higher for people in their late 50s. But from 2015 to 2019, shown in green, that switched. So it was more common in people at age 50 than at age 59. Now let's look at the chart for adults under 50. You can see the rate for all three identified stages of cancer has been rising since 1998, but those at the regional stage, which means the cancer has migrated through the wall of the colon but is still confined to the lower abdomen, has gone up by 50% since 2010. And since it's been 5 years since the end of the data for this study, if the trend has continued, we could be looking at a rate today that's 75% higher than it was in 1998. Statistics for depression and anxiety are harder to correlate, mainly because Obamacare increased insurance coverage. As a result, more people were able to be diagnosed and get treatment. So I'm going to cut out that early data and focus on this survey data from Gallup that compares 2023 with 2017. Overall, the percentage of American adults currently receiving treatment for depression rose from 13.5 to 17.8%. The increase showed up in every ethnicity, but not every age group. In Americans over 65, the reported rate of depression dropped by 0.2%. Since that's within the margin of error of the survey, it's basically no change. It rose in every group under 65. In folks between 45 and 64, it went up. In folks between 30 and 44, it went up more. And in folks under 30, it jumped by a lot, as you can see. So we can see that rates of depression and anxiety, along with the rate of colorectal cancer among adults under 50, have both risen substantially since the late 90s, and the bulk of the increase has come since 2010. While in folks over 65, the rate of colorectal cancer has fallen, and rates of anxiety and depression have also either stabilized or fallen. This is the pattern, and you can see for yourself the dynamics are similar. It's pretty well known that the brain and gut are connected. This Psychology Today article says the pit of your stomach is your second brain. So let's talk about how. This is the vagus nerve. It descends from the dorsal motor nucleus in the brainstem and traverses the abdomen, branching off into the heart, lungs, liver, and gastrointestinal tract. The entire wall of the stomach, intestines, colon, and rectum is wired with neurons and glial cells, the same kind of cells that make up the brain and spinal cord. There are 500 million neurons in all, and this is called the enteric nervous system. For comparison, the brain is estimated to have around 86 billion neurons, so about 170 times as many. At the intestinal wall, the enteric nervous system interfaces with the branches of the vagus nerve. The nerves of the enteric nervous system extend inward to the edge of the intestinal lumen, which is a layer of epithelial cells that form the inner barrier of the gut. These cells determine which compounds and nutrients get through to the body and which ones get blocked. The neurons of the enteric nervous system stimulate peristalsis and send sensory information back to the brain. In return, the brain sends back control signals that tell the gut how fast to move. Along with the neural connection, there are two others I want to talk about: the immune connection and the signals from the gut microbiome. As this 2021 study points out, 70 to 80% of the immune cells are present in the gut, and there's an intricate interplay between the intestinal microbiota, the epithelial layer, and the local immune system. In addition to the immune responses in the gut microbiome also affects systemic immunity, which means immunity throughout the whole body. The immune cells send signals to the brain and the rest of the body by producing cytokines and other molecules that enter the bloodstream. They also leave the gut and migrate to other parts of the body. The gut microbiome consists of around 100 trillion microorganisms, including bacteria, archaebacteria, yeast, viruses, and even these newly discovered strange viroids that have been called obelisks. Most of this exists in the large intestine. These systems are constantly talking to each other. So if something happens that throws off your mood, a job loss, or loss of a friendship, it's going to alter your immune system's behavior along with your gut microbiome. It's also why an injury or illness, or eating something that messes with your gut, can make you feel depressed or set you on edge. These feedback loops at first can appear to be a weakness, but it also means that improving any of them can improve all of them. So when you work on healing from an injury, or spend time with friends, or go for a walk in the sunshine, or eat a diet that supports your microbiome, all these can impact the brain-gut immune system in a positive way. I think of it like a physiological shock absorber. The microbiome mostly thrives in the large intestine, where water is removed from the intestinal contents before they're expelled as waste. Microbes consume undigested elements, particularly dietary fiber. Since it's a low oxygen environment, this mainly happens through fermentation that produces a ton of byproducts. And it turns out that many of those byproducts are necessary for our health. As I mentioned, activity in the microbiome is impacted by signals from the brain and the immune system. But it's also modulated by flavonoids in our diet. Flavonoids are complex phenolic compounds that are produced by plants as byproducts of their metabolic processes. To paraphrase this study, flavonoids are known to have a mountain of positive effects for our health, protecting against inflammation, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. However, only a small fraction of flavonoids, less than 5%, are absorbed through the stomach or small intestine. And this is because most of them exist as glycosides, meaning they have a sugar molecule attached to them. The sugar molecule has to be broken off before the rest can pass through the intestinal wall. Breaking off the sugar molecules requires specific enzymes, but the human body doesn't produce very many of these enzymes. So only a few flavonoids get absorbed outside the colon. The microbiome has a couple 100,000 different species. So for every flavonoid we consume, there's gut microbes that produce enzymes for it. The molecules left over are called simple phenolics. And those phenolics interact with the microbes in the gut before they enter the bloodstream. One thing you'll notice on this study's graphic is that in addition to the simple phenolics produced by the gut biome are SCFAs. I want to talk about those next. The acronym SCFA stands for short-chain fatty acids. They're called short-chain because they only have 6 carbon atoms at most. They're produced by the microbiome in the colon through fermentation of dietary fiber. The main ones produced in the gut are acetate, propionate, and butyrate, and somewhere between 40 and 60 milligrams a day can be produced. That's an amount equal to about 1/100th of a teaspoon, literally just a couple drops. And even though it's a very small amount, that small amount is still essential for our physical and mental health. The role of SCFAs in bodily function has been widely studied, but the field is still in its infancy, so there's still a lot to learn. At this point, they've been shown to have many health benefits, such as anti-inflammatory, anti-diabetes, anti-cancer, and cardiovascular protective activities. These images show epithelial cells in the gut and endothelial cells in the blood-brain barrier. Most of them are connected by what are called tight junctions. These junctions are basically formed by proteins that wind together to keep the cell membranes in close contact. And they're important because they block toxins, and cells use them to only allow specific nutrients and messenger chemicals through the barriers. It's been found that SCFAs are essential for maintaining these tight junctions in both the brain and the gut. But there's more to it. Endothelial cells also line the blood vessels, the lymphatic system, and have critical roles in the kidneys, liver, and pancreas. So a chronic shortage of SCFAs damages the circulatory system and the internal organs. And it also turns out that SCFAs induce apoptosis, which is cellular self-deletion in colorectal cancer cells. Studies have also found that gut microbiome dysfunction is implicated in depression, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's diseases. So this is a set of molecules produced in the gut that kill colorectal cancer cells and are critical for maintaining mental health. So now I want to talk about what I think are the main culprits. First, ultra-processed foods. We can classify foods by their level of processing. Unprocessed or minimally processed foods are things like apples or shelled roasted nuts. Either nothing has been done to them, or they've just been made safer and easier to consume. Processed culinary ingredients are things like sugar or vegetable oil. Processed foods are things like canned fish or salted nuts. They only have 1 or 2 extra ingredients, usually salt, sugar, or oil. And finally, we have ultra-processed foods. They are mainly composed of components of whole foods, things like starch, sugar, oils, and they also have added emulsifiers, artificial flavors, and artificial preservatives. So ultra-processed foods, on top of being high in calories and containing artificial additives, are short on the 2 things we just talked about that are critical to the microbiome and immune system: fiber and flavonoids. Eating large amounts of these foods means our bodies miss out on a lot. And you might say, so what though? What does it really matter if I eat a heavily processed ice cream cone a couple times a week or go through the drive-thru for lunch on a Tuesday? Of course, it probably wouldn't matter very much, since that would only be around 5 or 10% of the diet. So let's look at how much of the American diet is made up of ultra-processed food. This study looked at American diets between 2001 and 2018. In 2001, processed ingredients like refined sugar and vegetable oil made up 3.9% of the American diet, and in 2018 they made up 5.4%, so a slight increase. For regular processed foods, the rate was 9.8% in 2001 and 10.2% in 2018, so virtually no change. Minimally processed and unprocessed foods, so basically whole foods, were 32.7% of the American diet in 2001, and in 2018 it had fallen to 27.4%, so they decreased. Ultra-processed food went from being 53.5% in 2001 to 57% in 2018, and according to the British Medical Journal, that's now at 58%. Of course, not all ultra-processed food is unhealthy. For example, there are pre-made smoothies, naturally flavored yogurt, and vegetable powders that are highly nutritious. But that's a very small share. The vast majority of ultra-processed foods are calorie-dense, nutrient-poor, and contain artificial additives. This study was just published in the British Medical Journal in January. It was an umbrella study that looked at almost 10 million participants in 59 peer-reviewed studies. And from all the data they looked at, they found associations between many common illnesses and consumption of ultra-processed foods. It's worth reading the whole thing if you have time, but for the moment I'm going to focus on this graphic. The researchers found convincing evidence of links to the following diseases: anxiety, combined common mental health disorders, type 2 diabetes, and deaths from heart disease. They found highly suggestive evidence of a link to sleep and depression disorders, and suggestive evidence linking consumption of these foods to overall cancer risk, and specifically colorectal cancer. Now, the caveat to the study is that the evidence is associational. They looked at aggregate data of human diets and health outcomes, so it isn't based on controlled trials. Because of that, we need to accept that these links are strongly implied by the data, but not yet proven. However, in 1964, there wasn't conclusive proof that smoking was a direct cause of lung cancer. But American Surgeon General Luther Terry nevertheless announced in a press conference his agency's findings that smoking caused lung cancer and probably heart disease too. At the time, 2 out of every 5 American adults were regular smokers. But today, 60 years later, it's less than 15%. Tens of millions of lives have been lengthened and improved because of the bold action he took. I'm convinced that to reverse these trends, we have to change the foods we eat. But I don't think that's enough. Now I want to look at a couple other factors that I also think contribute to the problem. The first is social isolation and disconnection. Social isolation and disconnection have increased in nearly every country in the last 20 years. But as far as I know, it's the worst in the United States. The Surgeon General put out this report in 2023, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. This graphic comes from page 14. The graphs cover the years from 2003 to 2020, so some of the increase in isolation was a product of pandemic shutdowns. But the trends of increasing isolation and loss of social engagement particularly with friends and companions, were already in place. The report points out that the loss of connection is being replaced with idle screen time. It also shows this: lacking social connection is more deadly than heavy smoking, drinking, inactivity, or obesity. This 2017 study examined the link between social isolation and depression in more than 1,900 adult participants. The participants were adults under the age of 65. Here's what they found. Poor social connectedness with friends and with relatives is associated with elevated depressive symptoms. Furthermore, our data indicates that the effect of social connectedness with friends on depressive symptoms is more predominant than that of social connectedness with relatives. This finding confirms the importance of friendship in preventing or alleviating depressive symptoms. Other studies have already shown that among elder adults, living alone contributes to symptoms of depression. But with younger adults, living with someone else didn't make a significant difference. The most important factor for younger adults was number and quality of friendships. By sacrificing time with friends for time in front of screens, we put ourselves at greater risk of depression and anxiety. This chart from the American Perspectives Survey shows the change in close friendships in the United States. In 1990, 1 out of 3 Americans had 10 or more close friends. But by 2021, it was 1 in 8. In 1990, 3% of Americans reported having no close friends. But in 2021, it was also 1 in 8. So think about that. 1 out of every 8 Americans today has no close friends. No one to call when their car breaks down. No one to take them out when they lose their job. No one to hang out with on their days off. The last things I want to talk about are active time and time spent outdoors. The relationship between time outdoors and better physical and mental health has been widely studied and it's well known. And time spent being active, whether it's a vigorous exercise or going for an easy walk, has been shown to be protective against chronic diseases in general. However, this study pointed out that by 2019, the amount of time Americans spent sitting had risen to 9.5 hours per day. Now, most of that sitting happens at work or in the car. But as this chart shows, even time spent sitting when not at work is mainly spent in front of screens. On average, only 30 minutes a day was spent socializing, and only 20 minutes was spent reading. For the last 30 years, we've been getting rid of time spent being active, out in nature, and with friends. And we've been replacing it with sitting and screen time. We've been replacing foods that nourish our bodies, minds, and microbiomes with ultra-processed foods that increase inflammation, injure our microbiomes, and make us susceptible to depression, anxiety, insomnia, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and cancer. And because of the interplay between the brain, immune system, and gut, harm to any of them affects our entire lives and bodies. This is why, when I look at the rates of disconnection, depression, and anxiety, and the similar rise in colorectal cancer rates, all among adults under 65, I'm convinced that they're related. And I hate to say it, but I also think this is just the beginning. We're in an emergency, and we're all at risk, and the time to make changes is today. And as much as I'd like to see public policy step in and help, the reality is no one's coming to save us. We have to save ourselves, our family members, and our neighbors. But the upside is that any improvement we make in one area will propagate through to the rest. Spending time hanging out with friends or making new friends is protective against inflammation and depression. And because of that, it improves the function of our microbiome. Eliminating the worst foods from our diets and replacing them with healthy whole foods directly improves our gut microbiomes and will help us be physically and mentally healthier. Not only can we make this better, we have to. To make all this easier to picture, I've put together this infographic, which I'll put up on my website, thesexyuniverse.com, along with the show notes. That's where you can find more links and references if you'd like to look some stuff up. And of course, the show notes are free to use, reuse, and share, as is the infographic. I believe the ideal life is a non-stop process of learning and growing. Thanks for learning and growing with me. I want to hear what you think. So please put your thoughts or information you'd like to share in the comment section below. Stay on your game, and I'll see you next time on The Sexy Universe.